Welcome to all of you. Good evening. I am Dr. Rana, Associate Professor of History, PG Department of History, Annales School College, Cooch, Behar. Today we are going to discuss about the objectivity of Ranke and how Ranke changed the course of history. This is also in the second sem PG syllabus of the Panchanal Burma University. Students requested me for a talk, so I am delighted today to give this talk. First of all, we must know how the history as a discipline emerged. In the medieval Europe, there was not any specific subject like history. History would have been taught along with philosophy or mathematics, etc. After the 16th century Renaissance, there was a flourishment of university, and especially after Ranke's pioneership, history would emerge as a specific discipline itself. Now we are going to talk about Leopold von Ranke works and impacts on historiography. History students are more than familiar with the importance of primary sources. I have already discussed your methodology class how primary sources are important in any research work in history. Historical research simply cannot exist without primary sources. This idea is not even up for debate. Considering the number of critics leveled against the discipline since the advent of it. To put it simply, a critical analysis of primary source is the bedrock of historical research. So we must go through our primary sources to unearth the unknown facts of the history. Like in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the archaeological excavation were very important. We have already discussed that. Of course, it was not always the way. History as a discipline was once very different to where modern historical research actually came from. For that we have to look to the 19th century German scholar Leopold von Ranke, 1795 to 1886. In the word of modern historian Edward Muir, Ranke is to the discipline of history what Darwin is to biology. As historian, this is where our own history begins. Leopold von Ranke took job as a school teacher around 1870. That's where our story begins. Back then, history was a very different discipline. The purpose of studying history was moralistic. The goal was to interpret the past in terms of present situations and agendas. As a result, the history books of the time were deeply in or according to the sentiment, according to the feeling, or according to the mentality in which he or she would have been writing this history. These histories were based on the accounts of other historians, secondary recollections, and often unverified and apocryphal beliefs about the past. We have already discussed there would have been two types of sources. One is primary sources, other is secondary sources. Before coming of Ranke, the secondary sources would have been given much importance. That means, suppose you writing history on the medieval Europe, you would just study the things what your other past historian write down. You are not exactly going to the sites or going to the archival material. If you are writing down the history of Rome, I think it is impossible not to see the Colosseum. So primary source is very, very important. What or not this traditional depiction of the past were accurate was largely irrelevant. The entire purpose was to interpret them in the context of modern issues. So when somebody is writing history on this basis, he wanted to tackle the issues before his or her hand, not the exact history, not the exact primary source would have been based upon. Ranke issue with this as a school teacher. He worried about presenting incorrect information to his students. I am repeatedly telling you that we must be correct. We must be correct and appropriate. So sometimes I wouldn't be correct. I checked the primary source, then I corrected me again. So this is the contribution of Ranke. The more history book Ranke read, the more he realized that all suffered from bias, inaccuracies, and inconsistencies. History would have been written according to the will who would have been writing those history. There are so many inconsistency, bias, and inaccuracy because they wouldn't be going to the primary source. The desire to find more reliable accounts led him into an obsessive exploration of the past. The Ranke turned himself into an expert historian. He was particularly influenced by the work of Berthold Neuber, a scholar who had argued more scientific approach to the study of ancient classical civilization. In the past, there are always glorification of the ancient past, ancient traditions, ancient civilization, Greek, Roman civilization. But Ranke stressed that we have to check and examine through primary sources about this. We shouldn't be just overwhelming, just glorifying the past. We have to check with primary materials. So Ranke objectivity somehow would produce a new method in writing history. In 1824, Leopold von Ranke published the first of his influential works, quote, History of the Latin and Teutonic Nation 1494-1514, unquote. What was really notable about this was an appendix titled, quote, Critique of Modern Historical Writing, unquote. So appendix became most important. This is a very unique thing. Not only the book, but its appendix itself manifested a new way of thinking of historical research, in which Ranke criticized and rejected traditional ways of studying history. He identified modern histories as biased, inaccurate, and unreliable, and proposed applying the basic ideas of Niebuhr to the modern history. According to Ranke, history could be studied scientifically, free of subjective bias. That means subjective. What means subjective? Subjective means what you think, what I think, what other people think. This all may be different of thinking, so different of views. But Ranke wanted to prove historical facts with primary source. Primary source cannot be subjective, according to Ranke, because scientifically it has been experienced, it has been explained. Like we can take the example of Samudragupta's Allahabad pillar inscription of Horatianus Prasasti, you may call it. This inscription inscribed on pillars cannot be tampered, but books written on Samudragupta can be changed. So if we go scientifically to the primary source, then according to Ranke we can write the objective history, not subjective one. Let's go with the Leopold von Ranke became the first modern historian to insist that historical research be based on primary sources. He had a chance to put these theories into greater practice after the Prussian Minister of Education read his critique, appointed him to the University of Berlin, and gave full access to the Prussian Royal Archives. With new original source material in his reach, Ranke committed studies on Ottoman and Spanish history. Those projects earned him enough respect to be granted access to the archives of Vienna as well. So now a vast source of primary study material would have been before Ranke, and Ranke, with his objective way, wrote down history in that way. Now we are going to study Annales School. Annales School may be termed pioneered the modern day historical writing. It would connected history with other branches of knowledge, and it widened the horizon of historical research. It would find numerous new ways, even the study of psychology in historical research method. Some of the most innovative and influential historiographic changes in the 20th century came from a group of French historians known as the Annales School. The method they introduced challenged traditional historical focus from prominent and powerful individuals and shed light on often overlooked or dismissed population of cultures. So they emphasize that history not only the story of the king, queens, their victories, the battle, etc. History also the tale of ordinary people, their mindset, their culture, their day-to-day living, their suffering, their struggle, their hope and anguish, all these things. Not only the beautiful or romantic or heroic story of kings and queens. To achieve this, they developed methodologies that examined evidence of broader beliefs, ideas, and attitude of common everyday people. They now began to study common man's belief, ideals, and ideas. They also expanded the boundaries of the field of history by interacting and collaborating with other fields such as the social sciences. This new focus on cultural and economic relationship, and not just a sterile political narrative, was a move that they hoped would bring us closer what they termed as total history. That means not only political events, quote unquote. If you want to make a total history, you would have to take account of the cultural history, social history, economic history, etc. Not only political history. Throughout the years, the Annales School would continue to evolve and innovate, and distinctive eras of annals scholars emerge. The founding the Annales schools can be traced back to French historians Lucien Favre and Marc Bloch, who began the Annal Journal in 1929 as a response to the French doctrine of historical narrative that had a monopoly on what the official historical narrative were. They believed that was a flawed and biased system that catered to showing political elite in favorable light and glossing over or ignoring altogether the histories of less prominent or privileged individuals. So before Annales School, emphasis would have been given on official records or document. These official documents, according to Annales School scholar, highlighted the king, queens, or privileged persons. But the person not so privileged, ordinary men, were not in focus. They also had the notion that explicitly focusing on political narrative left much to be desired by the way economic and culture interacted with those dynamics. History was not a static subject. Annals School shows that history is a dynamic one, always constantly changing, and only political narrative cannot depict these changes. We want a close study of economic and cultural changes also. They wanted to create an overview of how of all the political, social, and economic elements shaped one another and impacted the relationship within those systems. Fabre's work included how the material available to a geographic region affected its social, cultural, and political development. So Annales School also stress on geography. A certain region's geography would have been a marked impact on its political, social, and cultural life. Of interest of Bloch were the formation of hierarchies and how this relationship between elites and commoners evolved over time. He examined how the notion of legitimization of power occurred within society, even became ritualized to reinforce it. The combining of these two theories and creating a system in which multiple theories and ideas serve to complement and expand on one another would be the basis of the Annales School and its mission to create a total history, quote unquote total history. So everything was a changing. History is a dynamic subject. We cannot stick on a certain narrative. We have to explore. We have to expand our mind to different narratives to create, quote unquote, a total history. In the 1940s, a student of Favre named Ferdinand Brodel would lead the wave of new era of Annales School with the publication of his book, The Mediterranean. In this work, Brodel branched out from the Rankian model of objective empirical research and developed an entirely new concept, quote unquote, of historical time. Brodel theorized that there are three distinct layers of historical time that explain, quote, man in his relationship to the environment. So Brodel deferred to Ranke's objectivity of history and he stressed, quote unquote, man in his relationship to the environment. It means how you react to your environment, how you react to a certain situation. That exactly Brodel want to emphasize. He is associated with respective histories and they all move at a different pace than one another. And in this case, Brodel study, we can see there are a factor of time space. So a certain time, a certain thing happens in a particular place, but in another place that didn't happen. We can take example, many scholars have said different factors behind the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. Different scholars have emphasized that this situation to many extent would have been also in India, but there would have been not such revolution. So time is important, place is also important, is historical research. He analogized the ocean to help explain this process. Suppose you are before a ocean, waves and waves would have been coming and going after. So historical events are the waves like oceans. In certain time they came and went on, and this have been constantly going on. The type of change deals with things such as climate, geology. So he emphasized on climate and geology also. Influence and innovation of Annales School is unbelievable. Influence and innovation of Annales School is unbelievable. They have not been without their critics over the years. One of the most common of this criticism is the lack of meta-narrative for historical change. The basis for this criticism is that while the annals have been well adapted to explain and studying pre-industrial societies, they are less suited to the more rapid and fast-paced changes we see in modern society. Today, in modern society, we have internet, we have computer, WhatsApp, Facebook, etc. I am more than 700 kilometers from Cooch, Behar. I am at Kolkata. But I am delivering this speech, and this talk can be accessed by anywhere, as well as Cooch, Behar, to as well as any Behar, any part of the world. This is a very high speed. Today's lives became so fast. Today's lives became so fast with jet plane, with so fast railway system, and so fast. There is a communication revolution. Critics of Annales School say that Annales School focused on pre-industrial period, or that is mean before the Industrial Revolution. But after the Industrial Revolution, the world have been changed with the steam locomotive, with the steam engine. Then with came the steam-powered ships, then came car, aeroplane, etc. That changed total lifestyle, total narrative of the pupil, narrative of the history. But Annales School would have been failed to explain this change with their explanation. But during 1990s onward, it appears that there is an ongoing shift in Annales School that would result in yet another paradigm shift and a fourth distinct era. So Annales School also changed time to time. In 1990, we can also see a change in their way of thinking or way of historical writing. One thing that is clear, however, is that the legacy of the Annales School and the contribution they have made to the study of history over the course of 20th century and into the current, they have been groundbreaking and revolutionary. They have laid the groundwork for new generation to continue their work towards a quote-unquote total history, and to use the tool and method they mapped out to identify the causes of historical problems and take an active role in helping solve them. Beyond all these direct contributions, the Annales School legacy may be even more apparent in its indirect influence of historiographical thought in the 20th century and beyond. Their influence can be seen in the advent of post-colonialists, feminist histories, and postmodernist theories that are prevalent in many of today's disciplines and discussion. Thank you all of you.